Welcome to Discipleship for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive.
Yeah, we are really excited to get into this one. So imagine you spend your whole life, fighting for progress. You dedicate your energy, your money, your very soul to making the world a better place.
Right. Is this exhausting work?
Exactly. But then after decades of all this effort, you look up and realize the finish line just keeps moving. The definition of better changes so fast that you discover you aren't actually running a race at all.
You were just sweating on a treadmill.
Sweating on a treadmill, entirely terrified of standing still. And, well, over a century ago, a man realized that modern society was doing exactly that. He looked at a culture that was just obsessed with moving forward, and he asked one incredibly annoying, devastating question.
Forward toward what?
Yes, forward toward what?
It really is the ultimate question, isn't it? I mean, if you don't know where you were going, any road will get you there, but you will probably hate the destination. And that is exactly what we are exploring today.
Right. So we are diving deep into the mind of G.K. Chesterton, specifically focusing on chapters 7 through 9 of his masterpiece, Orthodoxy.
Those chapters are The Eternal Revolution, The Romance of Orthodoxy, and Authority and the Adventurer.
But, we're not here to just do a dry literary review of an early 20th century British writer. Our mission for this deep dive is very specific.
We want to act as thoughtful Christian mentors for you, the listener.
Exactly. We want to take Chesterton's soaring, brilliant, and honestly sometimes utterly bizarre intellect and hold it up to the light of what we call the master instruction source.
Which is, of course, the 8 core instructions from Jesus for discipleship. These are the bedrock requirements for following Christ.
Just to remind everyone, those are repentance and faith, self-denial and cross-bearing, total devotion to God's kingdom, humility and service, the law of love, secret obedience, forgiveness, and fruitfulness.
So we are going to see how Chesterton's apologetics map onto these very grounded, very demanding instructions from Christ himself.
And the central burden of these chapters is just staggering when you really get into the mechanics of what he's doing. He is trying to form a specific kind of believer here.
Yes, because he is speaking to an audience, much like our audience today, actually, that assumes Orthodox Christian doctrine is basically a restrictive cage.
Right, like a dusty set of boring rules designed by angry Puritans just to stop you from having any fun, or, stopping you from making any scientific or social progress.
But Chesterton wants to completely flip that upside down. He wants you to realize that this cage of orthodoxy is actually the only logical foundation for true rebellion.
A foundation for wild romance and for what he calls a gigantic joy.
Exactly. And the way he diagnoses the modern mind's inability to even know what it wants is fascinating.
Yeah.
It immediately brings us face to face with our first core instruction, which is total devotion.
Because Jesus says a disciple cannot serve 2 masters. We are commanded to seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness.
But here's the catch. To follow Jesus with total devotion, you must actually know what that kingdom looks like. You have to possess a concrete vision of the ideal.
Okay, let's look at the mechanics of that. Because everybody today talks about progress. I mean, you can't scroll through social media or attend a corporate meeting without hearing about driving progress or evolution.
Oh, constantly.
But Chesterton argues that words like evolution and progress are totally meaningless unless you have a fixed standard of value.
Right, because Chesterton points out that nature itself has no principle. People will look at the animal kingdom and say, look, there is no equality in nature. The strong eat the weak. Therefore, equality is a myth.
And Chesterton agrees entirely that there is no equality in nature.
He does. But he brilliantly points out that there is also no inequality in nature. Both of those concepts are human ideals.
Wait, break that down for me, because an evolutionary mindset would just say the cat is the winner, right? Like, the cat survived.
Well, right, but only if survival is the metric you've chosen. Chesterton says that if the mouse happened to hold a deeply pessimistic Schopenhauer-style philosophy, the mouse might think it actually defeated the cat by dying.
Oh, wow. Like escaping the miserable burden of existence.
Exactly. Or it might think it won by giving the cat terrible indigestion.
That is hilarious.
The point is, you cannot say the cat scores unless there is an objective system of scoring. Nature doesn't provide a scoreboard. God does.
Mm-hmm.
The kingdom of God is the scoreboard.
And because modern people have thrown away that fixed vision of the best, the kingdom, they fall back on the vaguest language imaginable to describe what they want.
Yes, Chesterton goes after thinkers who use physical metaphors because they are literally too cowardly to define what is actually good.
He points out that saying someone lived the higher life is just a gross metaphor from a 10-foot measuring tape. I mean, what does higher even mean?
He is quite ruthless with Friedrich Nietzsche on this exact point. We usually think of Nietzsche as this bold, dangerous, radical philosopher.
The guy who talked about the Superman, right?
Yeah, the Superman or the Overman and Upperman. But Chesterton calls Nietzsche a very timid thinker.
He points out that upper is just a physical metaphor borrowed from alpine climbers or circus acrobats.
Right, because Nietzsche uses it because he doesn't have the courage to say the purer man or the kinder man or the happier man.
Ideas are alarming. Morality is alarming. So vague moderns hide behind physical direction. They talk about moving forward or being advanced. But as Chesterton points out, the word reform implies form.
You can't reform a lump of clay if you don't have a fixed vision of the vase you're trying to sculpt. You have to have a fixed vision, the New Jerusalem, and then you change the world to fit it.
Which leads to this incredible analogy he makes about a blue tiger. Oh, I want to spend some time here because it highlights the absurdity of our modern shifting values so well. He says, imagine a reformer who decides he wants a blue world.
Okay, a blue world.
So he works incredibly hard. He paints the grass blue, he paints the trees blue, and finally, after years of exhausting labor, he puts the finishing touches on painting a tiger blue.
He has achieved progress. He has moved forward toward his ideal.
Right, but if that reformer wakes up the next day, reads a new trending philosopher on social media, and decides he actually wants a yellow world.
Oh, no.
Yeah, his blue tiger is suddenly a massive failure. It's just a leftover mistake from his early bad manner.
So the whole collapse and huge blunder of our age is that instead of altering the real world to suit the ideal, we are constantly altering the ideal because it's easier. We just change the vision.
We repaint the ideal instead of repainting the world, which is an incredibly passive way to live.
It really is. Now, as we impartially report Chesterton's social deductions here, and we want to be clear, we aren't taking political sides, just exploring his thought. It's fascinating how he applies this to both ends of the political spectrum.
Yeah, he claims that an age of complete unbelief, an age that prides itself on being revolutionary, is actually an age of pure, stagnant conservatism. I remember reading that and thinking it sounded backward. How does constant revolution lead to conservatism?
Well, because the environment never changes. He uses the example of a greedy factory owner, the ultimate utilitarian capitalist. He names him Gradgrind, borrowing from Charles Dickens' Hard Times.
Okay, Gradgrind.
Chesterton says that Gradgrind actually benefits immensely when the workers are constantly changing their revolutionary philosophies. One day the young modern worker is a Marxist, the next day he follows Nietzsche, the next day he's obsessed with some new utopian idea.
Oh, I see. Because their vision of heaven is always changing, their vision of earth remains exactly the same.
Exactly. They never actually rebel and force the factory owner to improve their conditions because they're too busy changing their minds about what a perfect factory even looks like.
But wait, let me push back on this. Doesn't having a strict, unchanging, fixed ideal make us incredibly rigid? I mean, if I decide exactly what the world should look like and never waver, doesn't that stop me from growing? Doesn't that make me the conservative?
Well, Chesterton would answer that a strict rule is not only necessary for ruling, it is absolutely necessary for rebelling.
How so?
Because if your morality is constantly evolving, you cannot have prompt justice for the oppressed. Let's say someone is exploiting vulnerable workers. If you believe morality is just a slow evolutionary crawl, how can you rush to the rescue?
I guess the exploiter could just shrug and say, exploitation suits this current stage of human evolution. We'll evolve past it eventually.
Right. You can only strike a sudden, decisive blow against injustice if there's an eternal test, an abstract right and wrong that exists at that very moment.
Ah, I get it. You can't condemn the exploiter unless you have an unchanging standard that says exploitation is objectively evil yesterday, today, and tomorrow.
And there it is. That maps perfectly onto Jesus' call for total devotion. A disciple cannot serve two masters. A disciple cannot wake up every decade and decide the kingdom of God has a new set of moral definitions based on whatever the culture dictates.
To follow Christ is to have a fixed, eternal vision of what is true, and to spend your life working to bring the reality of this fallen world into alignment with that truth.
It really forces a modern believer to ask a very uncomfortable question. How often do we adjust our theology to fit current cultural trends, rather than holding to the fixed standard of Christ's kingdom?
Wow, yeah. We're often tempted to alter the ideal because altering our own lives or challenging our culture is simply too difficult.
We want to repaint the ideal instead of repainting our own habits.
And repainting is a perfect word choice because it leads us to the next massive problem. If having a fixed ideal of a perfect kingdom is so logical, why has human history been one long, exhausting story of us failing to build it?
Chesterton has a very specific, almost uncomfortable answer for that. Rot. Human nature decays.
He fundamentally challenges the basic conservative theory that if you leave things alone, they stay as they are. Chesterton says if you leave a white post alone in a field, it will not stay white.
Right. It will become a black post. The weather, the dirt, the natural decay of the world will ruin it.
If you want a white post, you must be constantly painting it. You must always be having a revolution just to keep it white.
He notes that human institutions rot with horrible rapidity. Men don't usually suffer under old tyrannies. They suffer under new ones, things that were celebrated as public liberties just 20 years prior.
An institution starts with noble goals, and within a generation, it's corrupt. The only explanation for this constant rotting, this constant need to repaint the post, is what theology calls the fall, original sin.
Yes, and Chesterton identifies the doctrine of original sin as the only logical negation of oligarchy and the true foundation of democracy.
Okay, let's unpack the mechanics of that, because linking original sin to democracy sounds really strange to modern ears. Usually, we think democracy is based on the idea that everyone is fundamentally good.
That is the modern assumption, definitely.
Yeah.
But Chesterton argues it's historically backwards. If everyone is fundamentally good, then the people who have achieved the most power and wealth must be the best people, right?
So we should just let them rule. We should have an oligarchy.
Exactly. But original sin says no, every single human is deeply flawed. And again, keeping our impartial hats on, we are just explaining Chesterton's theological deduction here. He takes a radical stance against trusting the wealthy.
Because the modern secular world assumes the rich are morally trustworthy, or at least that they can't be bribed because they already have everything.
But Christianity in Chesterton is pulling directly from Jesus here, says that a man dependent on luxury is in a peculiar danger of moral wreck.
The rich man has already been bribed by his wealth. Christianity maintains that the danger isn't necessarily a bad environment. The danger is in man.
And the most dangerous environment of all is the commodious, luxurious environment. Jesus said it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom.
That isn't just a colorful metaphor. It's a profound warning about the corrupting nature of comfort.
So, if you can't trust the powerful and the wealthy to rule just because they are successful, who should rule? During Chesterton's time, the philosopher Thomas Carlyle promoted this very heathen idea of the strong man.
Carlyle believed that the man who feels he can rule, the man who has the ambition and the will to power, should rule.
But Chesterton says democracy is profoundly Christian because it asks the opinion of the obscure and the modest. It operates on an ancient church principle.
Right. In the early church, there was a tradition regarding the selection of a bishop. The candidate was supposed to declare, "Nolo episcopari, I do not wish to be made a bishop."
We must hunt for the man who knows he cannot rule, who feels utterly unfit for the crown.
Think about how this maps onto modern political campaigns or even corporate ladders. The people who fight the hardest to gain power are often the ones most thoroughly corrupted by the desire for it.
Jesus flips this completely. This brings us to the core instructions of humility and service and repentance. True greatness in the kingdom is being the servant of all.
It is acknowledging the fall, acknowledging our own constant need for repainting, and taking the lowest seat. The person who demands power is the very person corrupted by pride.
Absolutely.
You know, I absolutely love Chesterton's visual imagery regarding pride and humility. It's one of my favorite passages in the whole book. He talks about levitation and levity.
Yes, that part is wonderful.
He says angels can fly because they take themselves lightly. Pride is the downward drag. He paints this picture of fat kings sinking into the earth because of their heavy gold crowns, but the beggar's tattered cloak catches the wind and acts like a parachute.
Seriousness is a natural lapse. Laughter is a leap. He even says Satan fell by the force of gravity.
It is a stunning visual. Pride creates a heavy, selfish seriousness. We use phrases like falling into a brown study when we are brooding, but we reach up at a blue sky.
To be a disciple requires the humility to not take yourself so gravely. It requires the levity to trust God's grace rather than your own heavy self-importance.
So for you, the listener, here is a practical application to chew on. In your leadership, your work, your parenting, or even your social media presence, do you drift toward a natural pomposity?
Do you take your own opinions incredibly seriously?
Or do you practice the spiritual discipline of levity? Are you wearing the heavy gold of your own ego or the beggar's cloak of humility?
That is a vital reflection. And, once we recognize our fallen state, once we embrace this profound, lighthearted humility, it radically changes how we interact with the rest of the world.
It forces us to look outward instead of constantly obsessing over ourselves.
Which naturally brings us to the stark difference between Christian orthodoxy and Eastern or modern philosophies when it comes to how we view reality, specifically regarding miracles, love, and separation.
Let's start with miracles, because this is a huge stumbling block today. In the modern church, you often hear this idea that being a liberal or free-thinking theologian means you have to deny the supernatural.
You have to explain away the miracles.
Right. You say, well, Jesus didn't literally multiply the loaves and fishes. The real miracle was that everyone shared their lunch. But Chesterton argues that denying miracles isn't free thought at all. It's actually the strict, oppressive dogma of materialism.
He argues that materialism is a belief system that chains up both God and man to an inescapable fate. If you think about it, a miracle is simply the liberty of God. It is the triumph of mind over matter.
If you genuinely want the poor to be fed, why is it considered illiberal to believe that God could miraculously multiply bread?
Exactly. Materialism binds the creator. It says the universe is a closed, mechanical, clockwork loop. Orthodoxy says the universe is open to the freedom and love of a personal God.
And this ties into a much larger, very popular fallacy that Chesterton completely dismantles, the idea that all religions teach the same thing.
You hear this everywhere today.
Everywhere. They just have different rituals, but at the core, all major religions are climbing the same mountain to the same truth. Chesterton says this is the exact opposite of the truth.
Religions generally have very similar machinery. They all have priests, scriptures, altars, fasts, but what they actually teach is violently different.
He draws a striking visual contrast between the ideal Buddhist saint and the ideal Christian Gothic saint. Look at the statues.
The Buddhist saint is sleek, harmonious, and has his eyes shut. He is looking inward, seeking a dissolution of the self into the universal oneness. He's trying to escape the illusion of distinct reality.
But the Christian saint, carved into the stone of a Gothic cathedral, is emaciated, crazy-boned, and has his eyes wide open, staring outward in frantic intentness.
Staring outward, I love that. Gothic architecture looks like it's stretching, reaching for something outside itself. Because in Christianity, God and the universe are not just one big melting pot.
This is where Chesterton takes on pantheism, the idea that God is in everything, that the universe is just one enormously selfish person. He critiques people like Mrs. Annie Besant, who was a famous theosophist of his time.
She argued that we shouldn't love our neighbors. We should realize we are our neighbors.
But Chesterton pushes back hard. He says love desires personality and division. You can't fall in love with a looking glass. You love what is distinct from you.
God broke the universe into little pieces so that those living pieces could love each other.
This is a profound theological insight that goes right to the nature of the Trinity. For the pantheist, personality and distinctness are the fall of man. They are the illusion we have to escape.
But for the Christian, personality is the purpose of God. God deliberately created a separation. The Father and the Son are distinct so they can love. We are distinct from God so we can freely love him.
But wait, let me pause and ask the obvious question here. Isn't the idea that God is in everything and we are all one a deeply comforting, peaceful thought for disciples today?
It definitely is popular. You see it in modern wellness culture all the time, this idea of looking inward to find the divine spark.
Right. So why does Chesterton say this pantheistic idea actually leads to social indifference and tyranny?
Because if the universe is just one divine self-nu, then tyrants are exactly as divine as liberators. Chesterton contrasts a poem by Algernon Charles Swinburne, who embraced this pantheistic all-is-one idea with the actions of Giuseppe Garibaldi.
Garibaldi was the Italian general who actually fought for freedom against corrupt regimes, right?
Yes. And Chesterton says, if you look inward and say, I am the universe and the universe is me, you might find a temporary sense of inner peace at a wellness retreat, but you won't overthrow a corrupt king.
Why?
Because the corrupt king is also you and also God. What is there to fight?
Wow, I've never looked at it that way. It completely paralyzes justice.
Exactly. But Western Christian theology says, I am I, thou art thou. God is transcendent, God is above and distinct from the corrupt king.
That transcendent theology is what drives righteous indignation. It is what drives people to look at an oppressed neighbor, see them as a distinct, beloved child of God, and rush to their rescue.
And there's the alignment with Jesus, the law of love. Jesus commands us to actively love our enemies and our neighbors as distinct beings, treating them as we wish to be treated.
We don't absorb them into our cosmic consciousness. We serve them in the physical world. But, we do need some wisdom and discernment here as we read Chesterton.
We do. He strongly champions this righteous, almost militaristic Western energy-fighting tyrants rushing to the rescue. But Jesus' core instructions also emphasize non-resistance, turning the other cheek, and enduring persecution.
That is a crucial nuance for the modern reader. Chesterton is defending the active, outward-looking nature of Christian love against a passive, inward-looking apathy. He's right that we must care about the physical and social realities of our neighbors.
However, modern disciples must discern where fighting tyrants aligns with Christ's methods and where it might cross into worldly, fleshly warfare. Jesus' kingdom advances through the cross, not just the sword. We are called to active love, but the weapons of our warfare are not carnal.
Because we are separate, distinct beings with free will, the choices we make and how we love, how we fight, and how we live have terrifyingly real consequences. Which brings us to the element of danger.
Christianity insists on the danger of the soul. Chesterton argues that life is not a predetermined scientific equation where everything ends up fine no matter what you do. Life is a thrilling story. A romance.
And in any good romance, the hero might be eaten by cannibals. The danger has to be real.
If universal salvation is guaranteed without any participation of the will, life loses its dramatic weight. The instant of choice, choosing between good and evil, God and self, is awful and important. All Christianity concentrates on the man at the crossroads.
Let's look at the mechanics of how we handle those crossroads, especially when we take the wrong path. Chesterton makes a fascinating linguistic point here that I think is incredibly relevant to our therapeutic modern culture.
About crime and disease?
Yes. He says we tend to treat crime or sin like a disease today. But think about the words. If you're in a hospital, you are a patient. You are passive. You lie there while the medicine works on you.
But a sinner is active. Sin is an active choice.
Exactly. Chesterton says, if you want to be saved from forging a check, you must not be patient. You must be impatient with forgery. You have to actively fight it.
It is a brilliant distinction. We often use language today that removes our agency. We talk about our trauma responses or our toxic traits as if they are viruses we caught on the subway.
But moral reform must start in the active, not the passive will. You cannot be cured of a greedy or profligate lifestyle the way you are cured of asthma. You must get up and jump about violently. You must make a choice.
This maps directly onto Jesus' instruction for self-denial and cross-bearing. Taking up your cross daily is not a passive experience where you just sit in a pew and wait for God to zap you with holiness.
It is the active, impatient fight against our own selfish ambitions. It also aligns with repentance and faith, feeling the urgency of the crossroads and deliberately choosing the narrow path because the danger of the wide path is utterly real.
And the beauty of this is that we don't do this alone, nor do we follow a God who sits far away, safely insulated from the danger. Chesterton paints an incredible picture of Christ as the ultimate rebel.
Modern depictions often soften Jesus, right? They make him look like a sheepish, gentle, ineffectual creature with a perfectly glowing halo.
But Chesterton says if you actually read the Gospels, Jesus is an extraordinary, dynamic being with lips of thunder. He threw furniture down the steps of the temple.
He used gigantic, terrifying language. He talked about hurling mountains into the sea and threading camels through needles.
And Chesterton goes even deeper into the mystery of the Passion, exploring the ultimate courage of God. In the Garden of Gethsemane, God went through agony and, in some superhuman, unfathomable way, doubt.
Chesterton writes that in that moment, God tempted God.
Yes. When Jesus cried out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It was a moment where God confessed that God was forsaken of God. Christianity is the only religion where God was, for an instant, a rebel. He passed through our human horror of pessimism.
Let the atheist choose a God, Chesterton says. They will find only one divinity who ever uttered their absolute isolation. Only one religion in which God seemed for an instant to be an atheist.
That thought is just, it redefines everything. Because it adds unimaginable courage to the virtues of the Creator. Courage means passing a breaking point and not breaking. A God who cannot suffer cannot be courageous.
So if the stakes are this high, if life is a dangerous adventure with a real crossroads, and our God is a dynamic, courageous king who actually suffered with us, how do we know we're navigating it correctly?
We need an authority we can actually trust. A lot of reasonable agnostics or even progressive Christians today might say to Chesterton, okay, I like your view on the danger of the soul, I like your critique of the rich, and I love this idea of an active, courageous Jesus. Why not just take those good moral parts of Christianity and leave all the rigid historical dogmas behind?
Right. Why do we need the virgin birth or the bodily resurrection or the doctrine of the Trinity? Can't we just keep the ethics?
Well, Chesterton's first answer is simply that the secular agnostic arguments against the dogmas are usually factually wrong. People say man is just a beast, a slightly smarter ape.
But Chesterton points out that man is insanely unlike beasts. Apes don't build temples of ivory or write symphonies.
People say prehistoric times were savage and fearful, but human tradition everywhere points to a fall from an ancient golden happiness.
And people say the church brought gloom and darkness to the world, but history shows the church actually preserved pagan joy, art, and color through the Dark Ages, while the hyper-rationalists of the modern era brought nothing but despair and industrial smoke.
But his deeper answer is about the nature of a living teacher. He compares the Christian church to a parent in a garden.
When you are a young child, your father tells you that bees sting and roses smell sweet. You don't just extract the good philosophy from your father and discard the rest. You believe him because he is a living fountain of facts.
He revealed truths to you that you didn't understand at first, but experience proved him right. Chesterton says he accepts the doctrines of the church not just because they sound nice, but because the church has proven to be a truth-telling thing.
Even when it teaches something seemingly unattractive, like original sin, which we discussed earlier, it turns out to be the exact doctrine that creates brotherhood and pity.
If we are all fallen, we are all equal in our need for grace. The primary paradox this living teacher reveals is that the normal condition of man is abnormality. We are born upside down.
That is what the fall means. What feels natural to us now, greed, selfishness, pride, is actually deeply unnatural to our original Edenic design.
The agnostic is dancing with his feet in the air and his brain in the abyss, and when he finally finds his feet again through orthodoxy, he knows he's the right way up.
And when you are finally the right way up, you discover the ultimate contrast between the secular world and the Christian world, the placement of joy and sorrow.
Chesterton observes that paganism and modern secularism is generally happy about small things, a good meal, a sunny day, a nice glass of wine, but they are struck with cold, incurable despair about the cosmos.
The fates are deadly and dead. The universe is a cold, expanding void heading toward heat death.
But Christianity is the exact reverse. Christianity is sad about the small things. We are permitted to weep in the sick room. We view the tragedies of this life with tender pity.
But at the core of the cosmos, behind the veil of everything, Christianity possesses a gigantic, uproarious joy.
The silence of the heavens isn't the silence of a heartless void. It is the hushed stillness around a sick bed, while outside, the universe is exploding with the laughter of God.
And to experience that joy, you have to accept the rules. Chesterton argues that you can't just pick and choose your dogmas, because if you want the adventure, you have to accept the structure.
He uses marriage vows as his example. He says he wants a utopia that avenges his honor on himself, that holds him to his bargain.
But wait. In our modern culture, freedom is defined precisely by not having obligations. It's about keeping your options open. We see this in dating, in careers, even in how people consume media. Commitment is seen as a trap.
Yes, but Chesterton shows how incredibly hollow and boring that modern freedom actually is. He says that without irrevocable rules, there is no fun and no romance.
If a bet isn't binding, betting is boring.
If you can break a marriage vow whenever it gets hard or you feel unfulfilled, there's no poetry, no heroism, and no true romance in making the vow in the first place.
The dogmas and rules of Christianity are not the walls of a prison. They are the walls of a playground. They provide the safety and structure within which true freedom, wild romance, and gigantic joy can actually exist. This requires binding ourselves to Christ's instructions.
Which brings us to the final two core instructions of Jesus in our master instruction source: fruitfulness and secret obedience.
Chesterton says joy is the uproarious labor by which all things live. That is the ultimate fruit of a good heart, a deep cosmic joy that sustains you even in worldly sorrow. Fruitfulness isn't just about productivity, it's about producing a life that echoes the joy of heaven.
But then he looks at Jesus and makes an observation about secret obedience that fundamentally shifted how I read the Gospels. Jesus told us to fast and pray in secret. But what did Jesus himself keep secret?
Chesterton observes that Jesus did not conceal his tears. He wept openly over Jerusalem and at the tomb of Lazarus.
He did not conceal his anger. He openly threw tables in the temple and called the Pharisees whitewashed tombs. But there was one thing he covered constantly by abrupt silence or isolation.
There was something too great for God to show us when he walked upon our earth, and Chesterton fancies that it was his mirth.
His joy. His joy was so massive, so blinding, that our frail, fallen frames could not have endured it. It was his gigantic secret.
Jesus practiced the ultimate secret obedience by hiding the overwhelming magnitude of his divine joy, enduring the cross for the joy set before him, as the writer of Hebrews says.
Now, as we bring the entirety of Chesterton's argument down to the ground for the modern listener's walk with Jesus, we do need to look at gaps, tensions, or imbalances. We must carefully apply discernment to everything we read, even a classic like Orthodoxy.
Yes, because as brilliant as Chesterton is, no human writer is perfect. If you read these chapters closely, Chesterton frequently equates the triumphs of Western European civilization, what he calls the raid and rescue, fighting tyrants, political success, even alluding positively to the Crusades, with the truth of Christianity itself.
His historical points about the church preserving art and reason are brilliant. But modern disciples must remember that Jesus explicitly told Pilate, "My kingdom is not of this world."
We must be very careful not to confuse cultural or political dominance with true fruitfulness or the total devotion that Jesus requires. Sometimes the Western energy to dethrone tyrants does align with justice and the law of love.
But often, the way of the cross looks completely different from political victory. It looks like quiet suffering, martyrdom, and secret obedience. The church is not identical to Western civilization. And our hope is not in the political machinery of any nation, but in the resurrected Christ.
Exactly. We can't baptize political dominance, so here's a practical application for you, the listener. Take an honest inventory of your own discipleship. Are you viewing your faith as an endless, tedious set of restrictions designed to keep you from enjoying life?
Or do you see the dogmas of Christianity, the core instructions of Jesus, as the solid walls of a playground that actually allow for a life of massive joy, thrilling adventure, and real meaning?
Because the stakes are real, the romance is real, and the joy is waiting, but you have to actively choose it.
It requires a profound shift in perspective. It requires letting the living teacher of the church, guided by the Spirit, turn you right side up so you can see the cosmos clearly.
It means trusting that the fixed ideal of God's kingdom is far more beautiful and far more revolutionary than the constantly shifting values of the modern world.
And as we close, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over. Chesterton noted a tragic irony about his rationalist friends who fought the church for the sake of freedom.
He realized they ended up throwing away freedom itself just to spite the church. They would argue that human free will didn't exist, reducing humans to mere biological machines just to prove God couldn't judge us.
They would sacrifice humanity itself just to prove the non-existence of God. The fanatic who wrecks the world out of hatred for the altar is a tragic figure.
So ask yourself, as a disciple, are you building your life on the solid, reality-affirming instructions of Jesus, which protect human dignity, agency, and joy? Or are you building on the shifting sands of whatever philosophy happens to be popular today, even if it secretly destroys the very things you hold dear?
That is the real question for our time.
That's the heart of this section. This is Discipleship for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.